just get on into it. David Fuller, Grave Secrets and the Twisted Double Life of a Killer. David Fuller was a family man, a father of three, who much of his adult life cunningly managed to stay under the police radar. Although he was described as an oddball by some, the apparently innocuous pensioner was hiding a horrific secret beneath his veneer of respectability. He was guilty of some of the most shocking crimes ever dealt with by the English criminal justice system, spanning 3 decades. Born on the 4th of September 1954, his criminal life began early. At school, he got into trouble for stealing bikes and damaging properties in fires, one of the McDonald triad's telltale signs of things to come. By the 1970s, however, his criminal activity had escalated, and he was convicted of a number of creeper-type domestic burglaries, insidious crimes that would make his victims feel frightened and vulnerable. He would often break into properties through rear windows. These crimes clearly set the scene and proved delectable. His later perverse activities, the prologue to the murders he would commit a decade later. Although Fuller found himself in court in 1973 and 1977 and pleaded guilty to 3 domestic burglaries and a string of other offences, he was never actually jailed or convicted of a violent crime. Perhaps the facade of pleasant man fooled the judge, as it would fool so many others in the years to come. A chilling reminder that evil personified walks with us every day in ordinary towns and unmemorable places. Fuller would use his pleasant persona to successfully evade the law for 4 decades. In 1987, 25-year-old Wendy Knell had her whole life ahead of her. As a manager of Super Snaps on Camden Road, Wendy was a happy, independent young woman who was described by her children as funny, hard-working and longing for children. She was in a successful relationship with a long-term boyfriend, Ian Blas, who was intending to propose to her on a planned trip to Paris. Her future looked bright and she was excited about what it held. Little did Wendy realise as she went about her everyday business, politely chatting to people in the shop where she worked, that evil was lurking in plain sight. At the start of summer, a season filled with so much hope, life and promise, how was Wendy to know she would never see another, and that her well-made plans of marriage and a future filled with love and children would be savagely snuffed out? On the 22nd of June 1987, Ian dropped Wendy off at a bedsit in Guildford Road, Tunbridge Wells, where she had moved after the breakdown of her previous marriage. It was the last time he would see her alive. Unbeknown to Wendy, David Fuller had been secretly stalking her for many months, having identified her as an ideal victim because she was vulnerable, she was young, she lived alone, and she had a ground floor studio flat. Wendy never stood a chance. That evening, Fuller entered her property, possibly through an unlocked window, and carried out a brutal and horrific attack on her. He viciously beat her around the head with a blunt object, then strangled her to death. Although she lived in a flat and the walls were thin, neighbours did not hear her scream, and this, along with the heinous would later be described as the stuff of nightmares. Filled with adrenaline and concern for Wendy, Ian spotted her on the bed. Desperate for her to be okay, he urged her to wake up before taking in the grim reality of the scene before him. Although Wendy's head was visible, her body was covered by a duvet. Ian pulled the duvet off her shoulders, lifted her right arm up and attempted to open one of her eyelids. It was then he realised life as he knew it had come to an end. Devastated, he left the flat to alert the police. A post-mortem later revealed that Wendy had been SA'd. Was found in her mouth, vagina and on her duvet. There was also evidence of anal penetration. Authorities believe that this heinous SA could have taken place after death. Blood pattern analysis suggested her body had been moved into different positions, or she was bleeding profusely from head wounds, allowing her monstrous attacker to SA her in a variety of ways. Frustratingly for police, the only clue was a distinctive bloody foot mark on the cuff of Wendy's blouse and a fingerprint on a plastic bag. Wendy's heinous murder sent shockwaves through her local community, which was devastated by such a violent crime and the loss of such a promising young woman. Worse was to come, however, as later that same year another innocent young woman would lose her life to similarly horrific circumstances. Like Wendy, 20-year-old Caroline Pierce had her whole life ahead of her. Living just a quarter of a mile away from where Wendy had worked, she was eminently aware of her vulnerability and had recently arranged for window locks to be repaired at her flat. Like Wendy, she had a good job as manager at Buster Brown's, an American restaurant on Camden Road, and was a happy, lively young woman. Caroline spent 24th of November 1987 with friends, saying goodbye to them and taking a taxi home. On that cold and dreary evening, she could never have imagined the horror that awaited her. Although neighbours would later report hearing a number of high-pitched screams that night, tragically no one went to investigate. It is unclear if she ever actually made it into her property, because Caroline vanished that night and would not be found until the 15th of December, when a farm worker discovered her naked body almost 40 miles from her flat, in a water-filled dike on Romney Marsh. Caroline's body had been carefully hidden. In fact, were it not for the elevated position of the tractor's cab, she would probably have remained undiscovered for much longer. Caroline's body was naked, apart from a pair of tights, and like Wendy, it was determined that she had been beaten around the head with a blunt object and strangled. Unfortunately, due to decomposition and the fact that her body had been left in water for so long, the full extent of her ordeal was never fully established, but it was clear that she had been SA'd as seen found on her tights. The brutal killings of these two young women soon became known as the bedsit murders, due to the fact that both victims had lived alone in flats. The police were certain that the cases were linked, and the public, unsurprisingly, was on high alert as a result of the climate of fear and the belief that a deranged serial killer was on the loose. A killer with warped sexual desires who spent time desecrating their victims' bodies after death. There was a significant police presence in the area. Knowing that they were looking for a highly organised, dangerous, methodical killer who had selected his victims coldly, and after observing them for some time, the police desperately tried to find clues to lead them to this pernicious perpetrator. Sadly, though, forensic science was in its infancy in 1987, and the National DNA Database wouldn't be created himself. His brother's DNA had been matched to him, and the chances of the crime scene DNA belonging to someone was 1,000,000,000 to 1. This was exactly the breakthrough officers needed. In the early hours of the 3rd of December 2020, police attended Fuller's home in Heathfield, where he lived an apparently ordinary life with his wife and teenage son. He was immediately arrested and a sample of his DNA was taken. Within 36 hours, police had a positive crime scene DNA match, and after over 3 decades, it seemed that they finally had their killer. Of course, nothing is ever that easy, and it is rare that a brutal murderer accepts her fate without a fight. Fuller was no exception to this rule. Instantly, he denied any involvement in the murders, and even went as far as claiming he didn't know Tunbridge Wells, a town that was a mere 25 minutes from his home. Police would later discover Fuller's invoices for electrical work he had carried out in the town, as he had trained as an electrician while working in the Navy shipyards of Portsmouth as a younger man. The exemplary work of the scene of crime officers and scientists that worked on the original case back in 1987 proved invaluable over 30 years later. They had carefully preserved samples, and as the investigation continued, the net around Fuller began to tighten. A bloody fingerprint on a plastic millet's bag found behind Wendy's bed matched Fuller's left forefinger. The police then worked hard to determine whether he also matched the bloody footprint found on Wendy's hat blouse. Working with Clark's footwear archivist to identify the shoe, it turned out it was their distinctive sports trainer, and police managed to find photos from the 1970s and 80s of Fuller wearing them. Police also managed to establish that Fuller had often visited Romney Marsh in Kent, where Caroline's body was found. It transpired that he was a keen cyclist and often visited the marsh with his cycling club, or when bird watching, one of his fellow cyclists would later describe him as friendly and helpful, emphasising how this cunning chameleon could lead to such desperate existences. Fuller lived a double life, able to blend seamlessly into an apparent normal existence, while simultaneously committing heinous crimes. Like many before him, he lived comfortable in 2 very different worlds. He had married for a 3rd time in 1987, the year the 2 murders took place, and his new wife, a special educational needs teacher at Broomhill Bank in Tunbridge Wells, had lived in a staff house located just a couple of miles from both Wendy's and Caroline's flats. It was discovered that around this time there had been a number of complaints from young women of a prowler spying through windows and entering their properties when they were out. One of those properties had been Caroline's flat. Also, contrary to his claim that he didn't know Tunbridge Wells, it transpired that Fuller had once lived just 100 yards from the street where Wendy lived. Visited Wendy at her workplace too. Yet during questioning, he was still stubbornly refused to admit he'd been to either location. The full extent of the monstrous man's depths of depravity was yet to be discovered, however, and would only begin to surface after the police searched his home. Police learned that Fuller had worked in hospitals for many years. In fact, he had secured a job in the maintenance department of Kent and Sussex Hospital in 1988, just 1 year after the double murder. Working as an electrical maintenance contractor, he managed to dodge any criminal record checks, as it was the employee's responsibility to disclose any past crimes 7 p.m. Then he would enter the mortuary carrying maintenance equipment in case he was challenged. Though there were cameras on the corridors leading to the mortuary and swipe card system logs, no checks were ever made to establish if any staff members were making an unusual number of visits to the mortuary. This failure in the system played directly into Fuller's foul hands. Investigators would later analyse over 150,000 hours of footage and swipe card data to track his movements. Discovered that he had entered the mortuary thousands of times. What Fuller did was alone in that mortuary is the stuff of horror movies. A search of his own would later reveal a huge catalogue of explicit material, which proved he had been abusing the corpses of women and girls. Later, investigators would establish that Fuller had abused the cadavers of at least 102 females between 2008 and 2009, the youngest being just 9 years old and the oldest 100, which is just absolutely disgusting. It's just, no, it is just absolutely horrific and disgusting. This man is just so evil and a pure predator, and I'm like, these people are dead, and it's like, just let them rest. Like, it's disgusting to do that as well. Like, it's bad enough with someone who's alive, like, doing it to people who are dead. It's disgusting. Like, it's just taking away even more of what that person wasn't. She would later, in order to abuse an innocent 9-year-old, the callous monster would have to remove clothes, toys, and a letter from her grieving mother. She would later describe her daughter as the kindest and bravest person she'd ever met, who loved like no one else and was truly grateful for her life. When she finally faced Fuller in court, she told him, "You raped my baby." She couldn't not say no to the dirty 66-year-old man who has abused her body. It really does break my heart. In total, of his identified victims, 3 were under the age of 18. 2 of his victims, Mary and Helen Agandi, who was 16 and 22 years old, had been sisters who had died in a car crash alongside their father. Their mother had been the only survivor of the crash, and Fuller's reprehensible actions caused her fresh agony and torment. Another victim, 24-year-old Azra Kamal, who died falling from a bridge in July 2020, was abused by Fuller prior to and only hours after her mother visited her to say goodbye. After discovering Fuller's actions, she stated, "I had spent 2 hours in the mortuary sleeping with her, and that gave me some sort of comfort. Little did I know that my daughter had been violated prior to that day and the evening of that day, so I would stop stroking my daughter's hair. A man had crawled all over her skin. In fact, she was so traumatized by Fuller's daughter that she decided to take the law into her own hands. She went to the police station where he was being held, armed with a kitchen knife and a determination to kill him," which honestly, I don't blame her, because it is disgusting. It really is. And you, like, as a mother or a parent, like, you would just have so much anger and just hatred, and you just feel physically sick knowing that this predator, a waste of space human being, was doing this to your child that had passed. It's just awful. Police officers managed to prevent her from attacking him, handcuffing her and keeping her in a cell for her own protection. She bravely maintained afterwards, "If I'd found him, I'm 99.9% sure I'd have put that knife straight through his heart, because he put a knife through mine." Absolutely heartbreaking. Police soon established that Fuller had not only taken photos of his foul crimes, but also video footage for forensic, as if it's not enough to abuse and kill people, and then also abuse corpses. You then have to bloody document it as well. Like, it's just, ugh. He transferred the which he hid in a box screwed to the rear of a chest of drawers in his wardrobe. One hard drive alone contained more than 800,000 images and 504 videos. That's insane. Police also found a number of printed images of the malevolent monster committing acts of abuse, sickening images of him with his in the mouths, vagina corpses, and images of him penetrating their bodies with his finger and tongue. He would regularly abuse the same corpse over and over again, some both before and after post-mortem. The forensic team soon realised that although Fuller's original victims, Wendy and Caroline, had been living and therefore murdered by him, he followed a particular MO with all his victims dead or alive. He identified his living victims, stalked them mercilessly, and learned their movements with his deceased ones. He found out as much information as he could, using social media to stalk them. He often removed corpses from fridges and abused the floor in various positions, as he did with his live victims. His meticulous attention to detail and organisation was another similarity. He obsessively recorded images of cataloging and indexing his collections, even using a black notebook to record his crimes, which is a trait of a lot of predators and narcissists. Serial killers, they like to have what they call trophies, to just replay it and relive it. Their fantasies is just This arrogant trait would prove invaluable to the police and authorities when his case came to court. The extent of Fuller's depravity knew no bounds, and police quickly discovered he had paedophilia tendencies, as well as dead bodies of young girls. Police found explicit images of children, many being classed as category A, which showed penetration of children by adults. One showed a child around the age of 3. Oh God. And a video showed a child of about 6 years old being honestly, I'm struggling to carry on with this case because this is absolutely disgusting. It's making me feel sick. Making me feel sick and upset just thinking about it and just reading it. Others were category B. One showed a girl laying on a bed while a man mocked her, and category C showing a girl exposing her genitalia. Fuller's grotesque stash of S8 images was the biggest ever discovered by police. It totaled around 4 million images and around 1 million videos. Police even found a pen camera in one of Fuller's jackets, which he had used to film his wife's friend when she'd come to visit. So he's even doing this to his wife's friends, people that he knows. He had filmed her undressing, showering and using the toilet, and then even photoshopped her onto corpses he had abused. It seemed there was no sanctuary save from his grotesquely warped and deviant mind. So when questioned by police, Fuller could not deny his corpses. After 9 officers spent 5 months working through the evidence found on hard drives, CDs, floppy disks, mobile phones and photo prints and rolls of film, the evidence was indisputable. Of the 102 victims as aided by Fuller, around 80 were identified, many through the armbands they were wearing. The operation to trace and notify families was huge and devastating, as involved 166 family liaison officers, 27 police forces and 320 staff a day over 5 days. So a lot of staff had to literally just go and tell these poor family members what this sicko did to their loved ones, as if they've not been through enough, as if they've not lost a loved one. They're now going to tell them what this waste of space did to them. Although it was clear that Fuller's abuse of dead bodies was evidence of his involvement in the murders of Wendy and Caroline, especially through his abuse and post-mortem, he still refused to admit finally brought to trial at Maidstone Crown Court on the 1st of November 2021. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, he still denied the 2 counts of murder, admitting only to the ending to his abuse of dead bodies. The prosecution highlighted Fuller's depraved sexual predilections, his desire for sexual gratification by observing vulnerable women, gaining control of them, killing them, and essaying them after their deaths. In a shocking turn of events on the 4th day of his trial, Fuller clearly realised he was back to rights and changed his plea to guilty. Mrs. Justice Gemma Grubb faced a difficult task: determine the sentence for this monstrous offender. He faced a total of 53 charges, many historical, and was given a 12-year sentence for the of corpses at hospitals and the possession of prohibited images and videos. The Caroline and Wendy's murders, the judge imposed a full life term without the possibility of parole. This recognised the planning and premeditation of the murders and the sexual and sadistic nature of the killings. Fuller is unquestionably one of the most cruel and sadistic criminals to pass through the English criminal justice system. He is a remorseless sadomasochist, a murderer, and a able to hide in the shadows, avoiding detection for over 30 years. It is believed that Fuller could have committed further crimes between 1987 and 2008, which are yet to be accounted for. A monster with such a ferocious appetite for depravity could not have lived an ordinary life for over 2 decades. Fuller's horrific crimes undoubtedly left devastation in their wake, not just for the victims but also for his own families, those women and children who had been duped into believing their father and husband was a mild-mannered man. Following Fuller's conviction, his ex-wife and children were devastated, disgusted and in shock. Acknowledging that they didn't know the monster had carried out these crimes, his shell-shocked current wife filed for divorce and sold their house. None of them recognised the monster who had been hiding in plain sight. Woman Fuller were not only the victims of his depravity, their families' lives were destroyed too. The judge acknowledged that those whose relatives had been desecrated by Fuller had had their world shaken and lost their ability to trust hospitals. Wendy's and Caroline's families' lives were blighted for 34 years, their nightmarish ordeal beginning the day they had to identify their daughter's bodies. Wendy's father was determined that justice would prevail, asserting, "One day, someone's going to ring that door and say we've caught him, and there will be a celebration, by God there will be, especially if he goes down for a very, very long time." He was right, but tragically the wheels of justice turned slowly, and when that great day finally arrived, he had already died. Fuller was indisputably a monster who showed no regard for his victims or their families. Understanding then the psychology of his actions is difficult and complex. Like many violent criminals, there's often a motivation rooted in the need for power and control. Bodies, especially in such a hidden and taboo manner, could have been given him a sense of dominance or control that he felt was lacking in other areas of his life. One of the primary attractions for a neck is the desire for an unresisting, non-rejecting partner. His desecration of Wendy's and Caroline's bodies post-mortem clearly demonstrates this deep desire in Fuller. Fuller also successfully managed to hide his apparent behaviour for years, which has an ability to compartmentalise his life, a psychological defence mechanism where someone suppresses their thoughts and emotions effectively, splitting their life into separate parts to avoid the cognitive dissonance of confronting their actions. This was evident when, even after he was caught and shown irrefutable evidence, Fuller continued to deny his guilt. Perversely, Fuller's job may have been the reason why he did not kill any of the women after Wendy and Caroline, finding himself in a prison where corpses were readily available to him in the hospitals where he worked, removed the need for him to stalk and murder vulnerable young women. This this reduced the risk of him being caught while allowing his thieving tendencies free rein. Undoubtedly, the flaws in the hospital systems where he worked, combined with his innate ability to compartmentalise his two very incompatible lives, provided him the opportunity to live a seemingly ordinary existence while committing heinous crimes over a period of more than 3 decades. A chameleon of the worst kind. The world is a safer place with him behind bars. It is a cruel travesty, however, that it took so long for justice to